This talk is about the Sheffield City Battalion, one of the volunteer battalions that was formed at the outbreak of the war, or very, very soon after. And much of the talk is going to relate to all the PALS battalions, the volunteer battalions, but we're using the Sheffield City Battalion as both an example that's of everybody, but also an example of what everybody was not, because there are certain unique features about the Sheffield City Battalion that I think are quite interesting. Within 3 days of his appointment as Secretary of State for War, Kitchener attended his first cabinet meeting, and he told a rather shocked cabinet a few home truths about what the war was going to be like. And while they were still in a state of shock, he also told them that they would have to raise a very, very large army. An army out of all sort of... Britain had never had an army anywhere near as big as the one it was going to form. And Kitchener got permission from the cabinet to raise the first 100,000 volunteers. Now, when he made this agreement, he set in train not only the future of the PALS battalions generally, but he also set in place a situation that made the 1st of July 1916 very much more traumatic for a number of communities. Now, interestingly, I found interesting anyway, Margot Asquith, the wife of the then Prime Minister, said of Kitchener, he may not have been a great man, but at least he was a great poster. And this poster here, or this picture here, is the Alfred Leet graphic of Kitchener with his pointed finger. Now, recent studies have shown that it was actually not used as a recruitment poster until quite late on in the war. And by far and away, the early posters that called out the volunteers were just plain posters without Kitchener's face. But we all like to think now, don't we? The mythology has been created that picture there was what drew hundreds and hundreds, thousands of men to the ranks. On the left there is Lord Derby. And it was Lord Derby who really kicked off the PALS phenomenon. He obtained the permission of Kitchener, and just about simultaneously in Liverpool and in Manchester, the PALS battalions came into being. The idea being, of course, that those who joined together would serve together, and that had its own implications. Now, the PALS movement swept the northern cities, absolutely swept them. All the northern cities, Leeds, Bradford, Hull, all the cities suddenly jumped onto the bandwagon of the PALS movement. And Sheffield was not exempt from this. But in Sheffield's case, it was slightly different, because the idea of forming a volunteer battalion came from the guy on the right, H.A.L. Fisher, who was an educationalist and at that time was Chancellor of Sheffield University. And he got alongside the Lord Mayor of Sheffield and suggested that they form a battalion of the elite of Sheffield. They didn't want the riffraff, they wanted the elite. And when recruitment began on the 10th of September, people who didn't fit the idea of their social elite were turned away. And so teachers, lawyers, stockbrokers, journalists, people of what we might call middle class people were accepted, but any of the hoi polloi like me would have been turned away. And that went on for a while until the organisers realised that there may be not quite enough of these elite people to form a battalion. And so gradually the admittance criteria was lowered and the recruitment area from which they were prepared to accept volunteers was widened. And quite a number of men from the areas outside Sheffield, like Penistone and Chesterfield, joined the battalion. Now, this idea of an elite battalion is really quite interesting. A number of the London territorials had this ethos. You had to actually pay money to join some of the territorial battalions in London. They were very snobbish. There was an idea that decent people didn't want to share a hut with the hoi polloi. They wanted to be with people of their own kind. But of course, this just didn't stack up in reality. And although efforts were made to keep it to an elite unit, it just didn't happen in reality. But the idea persisted. And the initial adverts that had been placed in the paper were never withdrawn. I mean, once they were out there, they were out there. And so they were stuck with this idea that the Sheffield City Battalion was formed of elite people. And it's for that reason that the Sheffield City Battalion was never known as the Sheffield Pals. There's the Leeds Pals, Manchester Pals, Liverpool Pals, but Sheffield always were known as the Sheffield City Battalion. And in fact, from the inception, they were known as the University and City Special Battalion. And that was the working title for the battalion as it formed. Now, it's quite interesting that Sheffield, a city of close on 500,000 population in 1914, couldn't actually fill all the ranks of the battalion and had to go wider than the city to fill the battalion. And why there was such a reluctance in Sheffield to volunteer, it isn't really understood. There's been various theories put forward. Sheffield was slightly behind the ball, so a number of people who were very, very keen had already gone to different cities to sign up. More cynically, perhaps, it was obvious to people that the war was going to produce an awful lot of well-paid work in the factories of Sheffield, and that's another factor. But also, I think the idea of this elite unit, this band of brothers who sort of didn't really want most of us, persisted. Now, Barnsley, as you know, just a bit north of Sheffield, much smaller than Sheffield, raised two PALS battalions, which were to go on to be brigaded with the Sheffield City Battalion and also the Accrington PALS. Now, Accrington is often sort of stated in books as the smallest borough in the country to actually raise a battalion. But just like Sheffield, Accrington couldn't raise an entire battalion from the borough, and they too had to widen the catchment areas in order to fill the ranks. And so the two Barnsley PALS battalions, the Sheffield City Battalion and the Accrington PALS, were to go on to form 94th Brigade in 31st Division. Now, even allowing for inter-battalion rivalry, I think this quote from Frank Linley is quite interesting. "I'll always remember the Sheffielders with their handkerchiefs stuffed up their sleeves and their wristwatches glinting in the sun. They were the elite of Sheffield and we were the ragged-arse battalion, but they were the coffee and bum boys." So it's quite clear that the initial idea of elitism persisted. even if it was maybe not quite as accurate as it should be, as it could be. So the battalion eventually formed, and on the 14th of September held its first parade. And they held the first parade at the drill hall, Norfolk Barracks in Sheffield, which was the home of the 1st, 4th York and Lancasters, the Hallamshires. And that too is given as an example of why the City Battalion found it difficult to recruit, because the City did have a territorial battalion and people were attracted to the territorials. Well, Norfolk Barracks, the drill hall there was just totally inadequate for a full battalion, and very, very soon after, training moved to Bramall Lane, which the football fans among you will know is the home of Sheffield United. And the lower photograph there is often produced in books about the volunteer movement, and it shows really quite well-dressed men marching up and down at Bramall Lane. And of course, that was a nightmare for the groundsman, because right at the beginning of the football season, 1,000 men marching up and down the pitch every day just caused absolute havoc. So very discreetly, pressure was put on to get the battalion to move, and they did. They moved to Norfolk Park in Sheffield, where the groundsmen there were no better pleased, because the battalion flattened the grass and even started to dig rudimentary trenches in the park. So everybody was very pleased when the battalion eventually moved to their training camp. Now, I think it's at least arguable to say that Kitchener's expansion of the army was perhaps not the best way of going about things. Everything was in short supply, and the very people who were needed to manufacture the things that the army needed were in the army. And so you got this ridiculous situation where where key men had just volunteered. There'd been no sort of discrimination, and so everything from the shoes, the boots they wore, to the clothes they wore, everything was in short supply, and not least of which was accommodation. Now here again, the first 3 months of the battalion's existence, the guys went home every night. So 5 o'clock, they got on the tram and went home. They had their probably supper, given the elite nature of the battalion. And then they came back on the tram in the following morning, much as they'd done before they joined up, really, you know, the daily commute. But 3 months later, their training camp was eventually available, and on the 5th of December, the battalion marched out to the training camp at Redmires. Now, Redmires is just west of Sheffield in the foothills of the Pennines. And it was a brilliant camp. It was brand new. It had been purposely built by Sheffield City Works Department for them. Although they marched out wearing, most of them had some sort of postman serge blue uniform by that time, they marched out on the 5th of December in absolute torrential rain behind their band and moved to the camp at Redmires. Now, it was nearly a year after the battalion had first formed that the War Office took them onto the official establishment. The University and City Special Battalion became the 12th Service Battalion of the York and Lancasters, and to which the addition was made Sheffield City. The York and Lancasters, as I'm sure you know, when I talk to an audience as knowledgeable as this, recruited in neither York nor Lancaster. The York and Lancasters were effectively the county battalion for South Yorkshire. and it had been formed in 1881 by the amalgamation of the 65th and 84th Foot. So the battalion was at Redmires and they started their proper training. What does proper training mean for a battalion that had very little in the way of instructors and very little equipment? Well, PT was quite popular, drill, and of course route marches. And the route marches were a regular feature out into the Derbyshire Peak District. And there's one guy at our branch whose grandmother remembers sitting on the gate and watching the battalion march past before they left their camp at Redmires. And they were there until May 1915. And the big advantage that the battalion had with this camp was that many volunteer battalions, you'll read, had to spend the winter under canvas. And you can imagine what a muddy field was like to live in when you were under canvas during the whole of the winter. But at least the Sheffield City Battalion had a roof over their head when it snowed in the early new year. So they were there till May, and in May the 13th, the battalion paraded, marched into town, into the centre of Sheffield. They paraded outside the town hall in Surrey Street, and they were, much I'm sure to the pleasure of all the lads there, they were addressed by the Lord Mayor, who sent them on their way with the good wishes of the city, and the battalion moved to Midland Station and entrained for their brigade training area, which was Penkridge Bank Camp on Cannock Chase. Now, the Sheffield City Battalion and the other battalions of what came 94th Brigade were one of the first troops to be posted to Penkridge Camp. And 1,100 Lee Metford rifles arrived. Some khaki started to drift in, and the battalion started to look a bit more like a military unit. They were there until July, when in July they moved up here to Ripon, and the area outside of Ripon, which became the 4th Army training area eventually. Here, most of the battalion started to use the rifles. They started to shoot. Some of the battalions, some of the specialist units in the battalion, particularly people like signallers, they didn't actually fire a rifle until they got to France because they were engaged in other sorts of training. So from Ripon, they moved south to Larkhill on Salisbury Plain, and they were there from November to the 20th of December. And it was actually at Larkhill that the battalion finally received the last of their khaki and kit, and were issued with Lee Enfield rifles. And the rumour went round that orders had been received, they were off to France. But immediately the orders were countermanded, and instead they were put on trains, shipped down to Dartmouth and loaded aboard the Trooper Malakuta and the SS Nestor, and escorted by 2 destroyers, they were off to Egypt. And 31st Division was part of the enhanced defence of the Suez Canal. Why was this necessary? Well, of course, as 1915 drew to a close, Gallipoli had already been partly evacuated, and the final evacuation was on the cards. And so the military hierarchy assumed that the troops that the Turks would release from the defence of Gallipoli would be used to threaten the Suez Canal again, as they had done earlier in the war. Now, this actually proved not to be the case. the Turks instead used their troops against the Russians in the Caucasus. Well, on the 16th of March, the battalion again was on the move, shipped over to Marseille, loaded into French railway trucks and sent north. The first elements of the battalion went into the trenches under the guidance of the 1st 8th Worcesters shortly after. And between the end of March and the end of June, the battalion had 4 short stints in the trenches. Towards the end of June, the battalion was moved to their final positions, attack positions. They were part of 4th Army, and they were to take part on the 1st of July. Now, of course, you don't need me to tell you who these chaps are, and you also don't need me to tell you that Haig didn't want to attack on the Somme. He never saw any real advantage in attacking on the Somme. There was no strategically important targets. He wanted to attack in Flanders. But of course, Britain was in a coalition. The French at that stage in the war were quite clearly the dominant partners in that coalition. And so reluctantly, Haig had agreed to join Joffre in an Anglo-French attack, which was to take place on the Somme. And the reason it was on the Somme was that the Somme happened to be the place where the southern end of the British front line and the northern end of the French front line met. There was no other strategic importance of the Somme. It just happened to be a place where the armies bumped into each other. Henry Rawlinson was the commander of 4th Army, and it was 4th Army that was going to deliver the attack on the 1st of July. And I'm going to say a little bit now about the attack generally on the 1st of July. And having said I'm going to talk about it, I'm also filled with trepidation because there's probably people sitting here today who actually know a damn sight more about the 1st of July than I do. But I'm going to give you my take on the 1st of July. Well, we know there was 2 plans. There was Haig's plan and there was Rawlinson's plan. And Rawlinson's plan, basically, this is the British front line, was to take the German front line and take this area here and pause before moving on to the German second line. Now, Haig thought this was far too timid. He wanted to. Bear in mind that no British general had ever commanded as many troops as Haig was now commanding. The sheer numbers of men sort of must have gone some way to convince him that he must be able to break through. And certainly he wanted a breakthrough. He wanted to break through on the Somme. He formed the reserve army under Gough with the specific intention of exploiting that breakthrough when it occurred by rolling up the German front line to the north. Rawlinson was always a little bit more sceptical. He wasn't at all sure about this whole idea of a breakthrough. And what we've got to remember is that Haig's instrument for delivering the big push in July 1916 was woefully inexperienced. The BEF of 1914, 120,000 strong, had certainly grown in numbers. There was now 1.5 million men on the Western Front in 5 armies, 12 corps, 38 infantry divisions and 5 cavalry divisions. And there was also 191 batteries of artillery. And this to a general who really had never before the First World War commanded anything much bigger than a division, was a huge resource. Now, I'm going to refer to my notes a little bit here, and I do apologise for that, but my memory isn't what it used to be. But having said that Rawlinson was more cautious, he still intended Fourth Army attack to take place over a very large frontage. And he based the frontage on the number of men he had available. And the calculation was 8 or 9 men per yard of front. And that gave him a 20,000 yard frontage. And what you'll also notice that in Rawlinson's plan, it didn't actually meet up with the French. So although the whole reason for attacking on the Somme was that to attack alongside the French, Rawlinson's plan didn't actually fill the gap. It stopped short near Fricourt. Now, when Haig got the plan, he thought this was just not on, and there was an iterative process that took place between Haig and Rawlinson. Haig wanted a hurricane bombardment. Rawlinson wanted a 5-day steady bombardment. Rawlinson's plan on a 20,000 yard front gave him a heavy gun for every 100 yards of frontage. And I'll say a little bit more about the guns in a few moments. I think Haig can be criticised most strongly on the Somme for his insistence that the attack take in the German second line. I think he stands less accusation for insisting that the attack marries up with the French. At least that was the whole point of the thing. Now, Pryor and Wilson, in their book Command on the Western Front, which many of you will be familiar with, he calls the process of developing a final plan Rawlinson's mélange of capitulation and resistance. Some things Rawlinson held out for, other things he gave way on. I think Pryor and Wilson also make the point that with the number of guns available to Rawlinson on the 1st of July, Haig's hurricane bombardment would, in their words, be little more than a stiff breeze. And so Rawlinson was able to argue quite successfully for the retention of his 5-day bombardment. Where Haig, I think, really is culpable is, as I've said, in insistence that the second line was attacked. For most of the front, and virtually all the front, the German second line wasn't observable from the British lines at all, which meant that all the artillery preparation that was directed onto the second line German defences had to be air observed. And also the very distance between the British front line and the German second line meant that only the heaviest caliber guns could actually reach the German. So of course it was the heavy guns that was directed to take to bombard the German second line, which meant that the front line trench, the first objective, if you like, was denied the heavy guns that were available because they were all shelling the second line. Now, almost a third of the entire British army in France was part of Rawlinson's Fourth Army. And this is the compromise attack that was finally agreed between Haig and Rawlinson. As you can see, the gap between the French here and Rawlinson's southern tip has been filled in, but the target now is the German second line. Fourth Army had 500,000 men, an enormous number of men. 5 corps were attached to Fourth Army, 8th Corps, 10th, 3rd, 15th and 13th. They were to attack on a 20-mile front, and the Sheffield City Battalion, 31st Division, was part of Hunter Bunter Weston's 8th Corps. Now, 8th Corps comprised 4 divisions, 2 regular divisions, the 4th and the 29th, which were due to attack at Beaumont Hamel. The 31st Division, which is a volunteer Kitchener Army division, was to attack at Serre. And the 48th Division, territorial division from the Midlands, was north of 31st Division, and it filled in the gap between the northern extremity of 4th Army attack and the diversionary attack at Gomecourt by 3rd Army. But 48th Division were not tasked with attacking at all on the 1st of July. So that meant that 31st Division was the most northerly division of 4th Army to attack on the 1st of July. We're often told that the generals of the First World War learnt nothing, they did the same thing over and over again. But that, of course, we also, those of us who have studied, know to be absolute bunkum. The generals set out to learn lessons every time an attack went in. The problem is, it's not always easy to know which lessons to learn from what you've done. But one thing that was absolutely clear to the British Army, the French Army and the German Army was that the key to a successful attack lay in the guns, the queen of the battlefield. And the tasks for the British guns on the 1st of July were many and various. I've already talked about the use of the heavy guns on the German second line. And of course, the destruction of the trench lines was a key element of the artillery. But also, not only the front and the second line, but also they had to watch for, observe, identify, register, and carry out counter-battery fire on the German guns. And they also had to supply an early form of lifting barrage to support the infantry. So all these tasks counted against the efficiency of the artillery. And the other thing I think we have to remember is that although there was 191 batteries of artillery available to the BEF at that stage of the war, they were mostly crewed by Kitchener volunteers. And if the infantry were woefully inexperienced at their task, I think it's quite likely that the artillery were equally sort of undertrained. There's a lot of stories about shoddy artillery rounds and the number of shells that the infantry found as they walked. But how many of those were actually bad fusing? Careless fusing, hurried fusing, from inexperienced artillery crews. It has to be a factor. So, I think we can say that out of the guns that were available on the 1st of July, The vast majority of them were 18-pounder and 4.5-inch howitzers, and they were firing shrapnel at the wire, as well as the German frontline trench, in an effort to destroy it. It's interesting, I think, to note as well, when we're talking about the artillery, we talk about high explosive shells. In 1914, Britain did not produce high explosive anything. We did not produce high explosive in this country. All the high explosive that the army needed was imported from Germany. And so in 1914, one of the first tasks that we had to do was to set up from scratch a high explosives industry with all the chemical industry support that entailed. And ICI, or MOND, as I think it was in those days, was very instrumental in these early moves towards creating a British home high explosive industry. But it was still in its infancy, relatively infancy. They were producing high explosive, but not in anything like the quantity that they would go on to produce later in the war. And I think it's also true, well, that although Haig and Rawlinson were both very, very impressed by the number of guns they had to use on the 1st of July, by the latter stages of the Battle of the Somme, and even more so in 1917 and 1918, the number of guns available would be seen as wholly inadequate for the task that they were given. So I think we can sum up by saying, really, that on the 1st of July, the guns were too few, too light, they were given too many targets, the crews were too inexperienced, their ammunition was too shoddy, and if the guns failed, the attack would fail. Now, by comparison to the British artillery, the German artillery, very simple. When the alarm went up, the German artillery just deluged the British frontline trenches and no man's land with everything that they could lay their hands on. Where lodgements were made in the frontline trenches, the German artillery knew exactly the position of the German front line and were able to effectively support the German counter-attacks that were made. Now, it's sometimes said, I think half in jest, that on the 1st of July there was no such thing as infantry tactics. I think that's a bit harsh, but we know what they mean. It's common knowledge that the men just got out the trenches, dressed the ranks, advanced at a slow pace towards the German front. The race to the parapet was lost. Machine guns scythed down the attacking ranks. But was it really quite as simple as that? Now, Pryor and Wilson, in the book that I've already referred to, Command on the Western Front, they've done a study, and they've come to the conclusion that every single division on the 1st of July did some form of rushing the German frontline trenches. There's no doubt about it that a lot of divisions, a lot of brigades, a lot of battalions went over in serried ranks. There's no doubt about that. There's clear evidence of that from personal testimony. But not all the attacks were failures. If we look at the 36th Ulster Division, they actually reached the German front more or less intact. they had a very, very successful assault on the German frontline trenches. Subsequently, we know they were unable to retain what they'd won. But the first troops managed to get there relatively unscathed. And those troops got out of the trenches, they dressed their ranks, and they advanced at a steady pace. Further south, the 7th, 8th and 31st Division, 30th Division, they all sort of, incidentally, all of them achieved their first line objectives. They all dressed ranks and moved across. So was that idea that we've got of the 1st of July really that significant? Was it the dressing, or was it, as I've suggested, the artillery? Now, how did this all relate to what you've come here to listen to today, the Sheffield City Battalion? Well, this is a trench map of the Serre area. As I've said, 31st Division were the most northerly division of 4th Army attack. And this is the village of Serre. And of course, these are the German trenches. The British trenches front line is here. And the British front line ran through a series of small woods or copses. And because I think men in 1914 were a far more religious lot than we are now, even if we are in the Church of England academy, they were named after the Gospelers, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And that was the British front line. Now, this is an aerial photograph of that same area. You can see the copses along the British front line and the German front, and that's roughly speaking the area of the aerial photograph. So, 31st Division, most northerly division of 4th Army. We're going to attack 2 up. That's 2 brigades on a 2-brigade front. The 94th Brigade was to be the left-hand brigade. The 93rd Brigade was on their right, and the 92nd Brigade was in support. Now, the 94th Brigade again attacked 2 up. And that is the Sheffield City Battalion on the left and the Accrington Pals on the right. And here you can see the British front line. You can see John Copse, Luke Copse, Mark and Matthew down here. Matthew Copse was roughly speaking the divide line between the 2 brigades. So the Sheffield City Battalion then went over 2 up with the C Company on the left and A Company on the right, supported by D and B Company respectively. And that meant that on the 1st of July, C Company of the Sheffield City Battalion were the most northerly troops of 4th Army to attack. It also meant that not only did they receive fire from their front, as everywhere else on the front, but they had an open flank and they were receiving fire from these German trenches here that were not being attacked because the plan called for the other division, 48th Division, not to attack here. So C Company of the Sheffields were the most northerly attackers on the 1st of July. And that's the battlefield today. or it was when I went there last. This here is now one wood, but in 1914 it was 3 smaller copses that were replanted after the war and have grown together as one wood. Matthew Copse, which would have been sort of just to the left of this picture, was never replanted, and it's just farmland now. And so this photograph is taken from what would have been the German front line looking down the slope towards the British front line. This is taken from the middle of no man's land, and it gives you a very good example of what a brigade frontage attack would actually look like on the 1st of July. So pretty much the length of that wood now would have been the width of a brigade attack. And this again is taken from no man's land, and it's looking north towards the tip here, John Copse, and you might just be able to make out the cross of sacrifice here in John Copse cemetery. And of course it was from John Copse and Luke Copse, a bit further here, that the Sheffield City Battalion attacked on the 1st of July. And this is a photograph taken with our back to the British frontline trench. This is, for want of a better word, the view that the Sheffield City Battalion men would have been faced with on the morning of the 1st of July. As we can see, we've got a rising ground. We've got the German trenches, both along the crest and behind the crest of the hill. And the target of Serre can't actually be seen from these trenches at all. At some points along that copse, you can just about catch a glimpse of the church in Serre, but for most of the men, they couldn't see where they were going, their ultimate destination. And this is the view looking out from the Accrington Pals trenches in Mark Copse. Again, you've got the rising ground, slightly obscured here by Queen's Cemetery, which was laid out in no man's land. But again, that same rising land in front of them. And this photograph is taken from the extreme southern end of the wood, looking along the British front line. In the foreground, the Accrington Pals would be advancing, and beyond them, the Sheffield City Battalion, and beyond them, nothing until you got to the attack at Gomercourt. So, we know 7:20, the morning of the 1st of July, Hawthorne Redoubt mine was exploded. 7:28, the rest of the mines went up, and at 7:30, the attack went in. The 12th York and Lancasters were crawling out of their trenches. They had built some saps out into no man's land to reduce the distance between the frontline trenches. They formed up and went in. And even before 7:30, they were incurring severe casualties as the Germans opened an intense bombardment on their forming up trenches along the front. Surprisingly, I think, given the difficulties that were faced by 31st Division, particularly 94th Brigade, a lodgement was made in the German frontline trenches, despite taking fire from front and flank. But too few men had made it across to hold the trenches, and the Germans started bombing towards them. And the few men who'd made it to the German front line, had to take their lives in their hands again and make it back across no man's land, which was an absolute inferno of shelling, which had prevented anybody getting through to them with help. And there we have the statistics. The Sheffield City Battalion, to use the terminology of the time, jumped the bags, 697 strong. It suffered 495 casualties, 71%. 240 of them were killed or died of wounds, and 237 were wounded. A total casualty figure of 512. But that wasn't the worst battalion hit on the 1st of July. That dubious accolade goes to the 10th West Yorks, who actually lost 710 men on the same morning. But as we also know, the attack, although at Serre was a complete failure, elsewhere on the front there was quite a degree of success, particularly in the south here, ironically, the area that Rawlinson didn't intend to attack. Why were they successful here and not elsewhere? I've already mentioned the fact that the men got out of the trenches and dressed their ranks just the same way as everybody else did. They carried the same load. You know, we're often told that the loads were unsustainable that the men had to carry. But those men carried them just the same. But lodgement was made north of Fricourt, and in the south of Fricourt, up to where they butted the French, all the objectives were taken. And in fact, here Rawlinson comes into for criticism for not supporting the achievements that were made. But it's hard to be critical of the man, really, given the fact that he was being faced with absolute destruction everywhere else. You know, he must have thought it was highly unlikely that the reports he was getting of success were actually accurate. So why was this? Well, I think the key to it really was two. It's my opinion that the fact that in the south the German second line trench was much further behind the German first line trench, and so there was never a part of the plan to attack the German second line in the south. And so the heavy guns that were available and supported by the heavy guns of the French, considerable damage was done to the German front line. So much so that the men reached the German front line before the defenders emerged from their bunkers, and so carried just about all their attacks, all their objectives. Now, it's tempting to wonder, isn't it, if Haig hadn't intervened and Rawlinson had been allowed to deploy all his heavy guns against the German frontline trench, if the 1st of July would have ended slightly differently. Well, 1st of July, I don't really need to tell an audience like this. First day of the Somme, 57,000 casualties, often said before breakfast, although it's not strictly accurate. 19,200 killed. By a significant margin, the worst single day's losses ever suffered by the British Army, or ever likely to suffer by a British Army. The battle would continue for a further 140 days before it ground to a halt in mutual exhaustion and the mud of November. But for most people, it's really only the first day of the Somme that's remembered. Overall, the battle claimed nearly 420,000 British casualties, 200,000 French, and well over 500,000 German casualties. The town of Serre was never taken because the axis of the attacks after the 1st of July moved from attacks going east-west to attacks going south-north, and Serre was never taken. In 1917, the Germans pulled back voluntarily to the Hindenburg Line. For those of you that have seen the film 1917, you'll know all about that. They gave up Serre without a fight. And when Serre was occupied, a number of graves were found of the Sheffield men who'd fallen on the 1st of July. And this led to stories emerging that in fact small parties of the Sheffield City Battalion had actually made it into Serre. But I think that's so highly unlikely. I think the bodies almost certainly came from wounded that had been abandoned in the German frontline trenches when the few survivors pulled out and probably died in German aid posts. It was also in 1917 that the bodies of most of the fallen from the Sheffields were recovered and managed to be given a burial. Now, John Bourne, who I presume has talked here, certainly he did in my day, great quote this: Haig has received grudging recognition for the strategic success achieved by his armies on the Somme. His success is rarely denied. It's merely seen as irrelevant. British perceptions of the battle have been transfixed by its human costs. These were on a scale utterly unprecedented in the British experience. They made the very concept of success appear to be absurd and immoral. Haig won a Pyrrhic victory. The nation suffered a psychological defeat. And that's as good a summing up of the battle of the first day of the Somme as I've ever read. And of course, now the southern end of that wood, what was in 1914 Mark Copse, is now the Sheffield Memorial Park. Even though, incidentally, it wasn't the site of the Sheffield Battalion attack. It was the actual memorial park is on the site of where the Accringtons went over. And that is the memorial to the Accrington Pals in Sheffield Memorial Park. And for any of you with a construction background, you'll realise that the memorial is built in very famous Accrington Norrie engineering bricks, a very well-known brick, very well of a good reputation within construction industry. And also in the Sheffield Memorial Park is this memorial to the 13th and 14th York and Lancs, the Barnsley, 1st and 2nd Barnsley Pals, who supported the Sheffield and Accrington's attack on the 1st of July. And although there's no memorial within the Sheffield Memorial Park to the Sheffield Battalion, Sheffield Corporation I've not been able to find out exactly when, but have placed some descriptive panels in the Memorial Park, and they're very good actually, very accurate. And you won't be able to see very clearly, but here somebody has pointed out, has described it as the Sheffield Pals Monument in Serre. Now I know that Sheffield had a reputation for being a sort of a bit left wing in the sort of 60s and 70s. And it's quite possible that whoever commissioned this report decided that Sheffield would have a PALS battalion afterwards, after all. And so it's there forever, the Sheffield PALS, rewriting history, as I think we see. But that is the Serre Memorial to the Sheffield City Battalion. It was opened on the 24th of May by the Bishop of Kampala. A number of veterans went back for the opening. And that's the inscription. And the inscription reads, "To the memory of the officers and men of the 12th Battalion, York and Lancaster Regiment, Sheffield City Battalion, who fell before Serre, 1916. And the monument, as many of you will know, is on the roadside as you go into Serre on the left-hand side, and a very prominent position. Now again, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to read these headstones, but so you'll have to rely on me. But I know some people are interested in headstones, and the men of the Sheffield City Battalion are relatively easy to identify because the York and Lancasters used a combination of battalion number and the man's own number. So this photograph here, 2 burials from the City Battalion, 12/709 Knighton and 12/1369 Hudson are buried there. And in Railway Cemetery, which is behind Sheffield Memorial Park, down in the dip, probably the site of an aid station, you see this. I found quite an interesting and moving headstone. It's from 12929 Goodlad, and on it, the parents of Alfred Goodlad have inscribed, "The French are a grand nation, worth fighting for. Vide Alf's letter, the 22nd of the 3rd, 1916." And when you think that parents had to pay for every letter that was put onto these inscriptions, that's quite a considerable commitment. Possibly relates to some of the more well-to-do members of the battalion. Of course, the men without a grave are commemorated on Thiepval Memorial, for whom the fortunes of war have denied the known and honoured burial given to their comrades in death. Now, the 12th York and Lancs were disbanded on the 2nd of February 1918 in the general reorganisation of the army, when the army moved from a 4-battalion brigade to a 3-battalion brigade. During the whole of the war, 3,000 men passed through the battalion. 700 were killed, including one who was executed for desertion. And again, possibly reflecting the background of some of these guys, 500 men were commissioned from the ranks. Now, there's 2 battalion histories published. The one on the right is by a guy called Richard Sparling, who was actually a member of the battalion who went over on the 1st of July. He went on to be the sports editor of the Sheffield Telegraph, and he wrote the battalion history. The more recent one is this one, which is the pen and sword version, Gibson and Oldfield. Many of you will probably be familiar with. That's a more recent version. And also, although I'm not a great novel reader myself, I don't know if any of you have come across this book, a book by John Harris called Covenant with Death. it's I think 1961 it was written. And Harris himself worked on the Sheffield Telegraph, and it is said that he one day was wandering around the office and noticed the Roll of Honour that was up in the newspaper offices, and that sparked an interest. And I would say, as a bit of a skeptic of novels generally, that this novel probably is the best description of the 1st of July I've ever read, and I believe it's still to be in print. So if you fancy a read, you'll find nowhere in the book does it mention the Sheffield City Battalion. But if you know the history, you know that that's what he's talking about. Now, something I think you might find interesting. When I used to come here, when I say here, to the Yorkshire branch meetings, I'm old enough, I know you find that difficult to believe, but I am actually old enough to remember when the veterans used to be, make up quite a large proportion of the attendance. And one of them was this guy here. Stanley Boucher, and he went over the top on the 1st of July with the Accrington Pals. This cutting comes from the Yorkshire Post, Yorkshire Evening Press. And again, some of you may recognise Alf Peacock down here, who was the author of the piece. Funnily enough, although he'd gone over on the 1st of July alongside the Sheffields, I don't ever recall him telling me that he saw their wristwatches glinting in the sun. Thank you.